June 4th, 2016 was supposed to be the kind of day that leaves behind nothing more than sunburns, group selfies, and grass-stained jeans. Coldwater Ridge Park, dense, scenic, and a bit too isolated, was chosen for the end-of-year picnic for Echo Valley Middle School's 7th and 8th graders. It was the school's annual tradition: one bus, a handful of chaperones, sandwiches packed in plastic coolers, and a winding day in the woods. Nothing fancy, just a simple way to say goodbye to the school year. Emma Leland had volunteered, like she always did. 27 years old, new to tenure, but already a favorite among students. She taught English, but it wasn't just the stories she was good at. It was how she made the kids feel seen. Students who didn't speak up in math class found their voices in her classroom. Her soft-spoken demeanor masked an inner drive that her colleagues admired. When she laughed, it was the kind of sound that made people pause. The bus pulled into the gravel lot at 10:12 a.m. Teachers gathered the kids, went over the rules, and handed out printed trail maps. It was warm that day, mid-70s, with a creeping haze that rolled in by noon. A ranger would later report a fog bank had settled near the higher ridges, typical for that area in June. Nothing concerning. Nothing that would have raised alarms. Around 2:15 p.m., according to multiple witness accounts, Emma stepped away from the picnic table area to take a phone call. A fellow teacher, Denise Caro, saw her walking toward the tree line, holding her phone to her ear. She looked calm, Denise said, maybe a little distracted. Some students remember Emma waving to them absent-mindedly. One student joked that she looked zoned out. What no one saw, what no one can confirm, is what happened after Emma passed the first bend in the trail. 20 minutes went by. Then 30. One of the other teachers noticed Emma hadn't returned and assumed she'd taken a break or gone to use one of the distant compost toilets. By 3:10, the kids were being herded back toward the bus. A head count was done, twice. Emma wasn't with them. At first, there wasn't any panic, just mild confusion. Someone tried calling her cell phone. No answer. Maybe she wandered off. Maybe she got turned around. But by the time the park ranger on duty was flagged down, and the group realized no one had seen her in nearly an hour, concern turned to dread. Cell signals in that part of the park were weak to non-existent. Radios were used to alert other staff. The students were loaded onto the bus and taken back to town. Authorities were notified by 4:35 p.m. Within hours, Coldwater Ridge was crawling with search and rescue teams, local police, state troopers, volunteers. Emma's car was still parked in the gravel lot, untouched. Her purse, wallet, and keys were locked inside. Her phone was missing. Helicopters flew overhead. K-9 units were brought in. They picked up her scent initially, about a quarter mile up the trail. Then, nothing. It vanished near a fork in the path where the incline steepened. No broken branches, no signs of a struggle. It was as if she had simply dissolved into the forest. For 2 days, searchers combed through the woods in grids, calling her name, checking underbrush, marking GPS coordinates. Her parents arrived from Bend the following morning, stunned, confused, still clinging to the idea that she might be lost and waiting to be found. Emma wasn't an experienced hiker, but she wasn't careless either. She'd grown up around woods like these. She wouldn't just walk off without a plan. On day 4, a scent dog led a team to a creek bed half a mile off the main trail. A red fiber was found tangled in a bramble, initially thought to be from the maroon cardigan Emma was last seen wearing. Lab analysis later ruled it out. It came from a child's discarded backpack, likely years old. Another false lead. Search crews expanded their radius. Drones mapped the forest from above. The park was temporarily closed to the public. Still, nothing. No tracks, no clothing, no cell phone signal pings. For every potential lead, a dead end. And then the questions began. Why had Emma walked off alone? Who called her? Could someone have been waiting along the trail? Authorities subpoenaed her phone records. The last incoming call came from an unlisted VoIP number, untraceable. The call lasted only 11 seconds. Theories started to spiral almost immediately. Some believed she'd fallen, hurt herself, and died waiting for help in some unreachable ravine. Others feared an animal attack, though that would have left remains, clothing, bones, something. Wildlife experts said the park had black bears and the occasional cougar, But no signs of predatory activity were found near her last known location. Then, there were darker theories: abduction, foul play, a predator hiding in the trees. But the area wasn't known for crime. There were no known threats that day. No witnesses heard screams. No one reported seeing a second person follow Emma into the woods. By day 10, hope had begun to fade. By day 20, it was a recovery mission. And by day 43, the search was officially suspended. Emma Leland was now one of Oregon's most baffling missing person cases. And Coldwater Ridge, once just a quiet place for field trips, became the kind of name you didn't say casually in Echo Valley anymore. Because it didn't feel like she got lost. It felt like she was taken. And whatever happened in those woods, no one saw it coming. Not then. Not for another 9 years. The first few days after Emma Leland's disappearance were marked by chaos, media trucks, and long, silent waiting. But it wasn't just the investigators and search teams who were interviewed. It was the children. Dozens of middle school students pulled into a situation no one their age should have to understand. One by one, they were questioned, their memories combed for anything that might explain what happened on that picnic day. And what they remembered didn't always match. Some recalled nothing unusual at all, just another field trip with too much sun and not enough snacks. But others, particularly those who had sat near Emma at lunch, noticed something different. A few remembered her checking her phone repeatedly during the picnic, eyes narrowing at the screen, her expression drawn. She seemed distracted, one student said. Nervous, maybe. According to a girl in Emma's homeroom class, their teacher barely touched her sandwich. She kept looking toward the tree line. One boy claimed that as Emma stood up to walk toward the trail, she whispered something under her breath. He didn't hear the words, just the tone, urgent, low, like she was bracing herself. No other student could corroborate it. It may have been imagination, or it may have been real. What stood out more clearly were the few conflicting claims about what came next. A pair of girls swore they heard raised voices coming from somewhere up the trail less than 10 minutes after Emma walked off. They described it as a short, sharp exchange, two people arguing. But when asked if they could make out words or identify the voices, both shook their heads. It could have been hikers. It could have been nothing. And in the haze of panic and memory, no one would say definitively that it was Emma. No student admitted to seeing anyone follow her, though one said they remembered a man standing near the edge of the trees shortly after she left. He was older, not part of the school group, but when pressed, the student admitted he only caught a glimpse and couldn't even say if the man had been real or imagined. Among the adults, the picture wasn't much clearer. Most of the teachers were busy supervising their groups of students and didn't see Emma once she passed the initial bend in the trail. One chaperone recalled seeing her walk off alone and said it struck her as out of character, but not alarming. She looked like she needed a moment, the woman recalled. Just a quiet walk. Nothing more. Her personal items offered no new angles. Emma's car remained locked in the same spot where she had parked it that morning. Inside, her wallet was still tucked inside her purse on the passenger seat. Her keys were in the side pouch, undisturbed. Her cell phone, assumed to be with her, was never recovered. Detectives went through her call logs and messages. The last text she sent, according to records, was at 2:08 p.m., 7 minutes before she walked away. It was short, just one word. There, sent to an unknown VoIP number that led nowhere. The reply she received at 2:11 p.m. was encrypted. Police said it contained a location pin, but the file couldn't be accessed. The phone went offline after 2:15 p.m., suggesting it either lost power, signal, or was manually shut off. Emma's boyfriend at the time, Ryan Keller, became an early focus. They'd been dating for just under a year. He was cooperative with police, handed over his devices, and had an airtight alibi. Cell data showed he'd been at his IT job in Portland, 2 hours away throughout the day. He was ruled out within 48 hours. Emma's parents didn't accept the idea that she had simply chosen to disappear. They described her as stable, grounded, deeply connected to her students. Her mother insisted Emma had never spoken of wanting to leave her life behind. She'd just signed a lease on a new apartment and was planning a trip to Seattle that summer. There were no signs of depression or distress that they were aware of, but without a body, without witnesses, and with no signs of a struggle, The case grew cold faster than anyone expected. With each passing day, the theory of a voluntary disappearance gained quiet momentum inside the department. Statistically, adults vanish by choice more often than they're taken. Maybe she wanted to start over. Maybe there was something in her life no one knew about. That theory devastated her family. Her father went on the record with local news, calling it lazy speculation. "My daughter didn't run away," he said. "Something happened to her." But behind closed doors, even seasoned detectives admitted they were baffled. Nothing made sense. No footprints off trail, no eyewitnesses, no digital trail, nothing to suggest she had planned this, and yet no evidence of a crime. And there was one final detail that haunted everyone who reviewed the case file. If Emma had walked away on her own, why did she leave her keys behind? No car, no cash, no exit plan, just a locked sedan in a gravel lot and a phone that never turned back on. Years later, some of those students would say they still think about that day, how quickly it all unraveled, how an ordinary school trip became something that never quite left them, and how the forest swallowed the one person who was always looking out for them. But the deeper question, the one that kept her mother awake for years, wasn't why Emma left. It was who was waiting when she did. The search for Emma Leland escalated quickly. Within 24 hours of her disappearance, Coldwater Ridge was locked down, and the county had already brought in emergency crews from 3 neighboring jurisdictions. What started as a simple missing persons call had, by the end of the second day, turned into one of the largest search and rescue operations in Oregon's history. Over the course of the next 6 weeks, more than 200 volunteers signed up, off-duty firefighters, retired forest rangers, teachers, former students, and even total strangers. They combed through more than 20 square miles of terrain, moving in grids, scanning thickets, marking trees with fluorescent tape. They worked in heat and rain, sun and fog. Each day started early and ended in exhausted silence. Cadaver dogs were brought in by day 5, 2 separate alerts, one near a streambed and another beside a steep slope, led to temporary lockdowns and expanded searches. But neither area produced any evidence. No body, no clothing, no trace, just empty forest, quiet and unforgiving. Both alerts were ultimately ruled as false. Drones were deployed for thermal imaging at night, sweeping the canopy and ridge lines. Helicopters scanned the higher altitudes. Dive teams searched nearby creeks. Every lead vanished into the dirt. There was no path to follow. Emma had left no digital breadcrumbs. Her phone, presumed to be with her, was still offline. The terrain itself presented challenges no amount of manpower could overcome. Coldwater Ridge wasn't just a park. It was a convergence of steep ravines, rockfall hazards, and unmarked animal paths. The forest could close in fast. One wrong turn, and you were alone, disoriented, and without signal. Rangers warned that even seasoned hikers had been known to get turned around here. It was around this time that an old legend resurfaced. Locals called it the Vanishing Trail, an unmarked offshoot from the northern path, barely visible unless you knew where to look. The story had floated around for decades, one of those half-remembered warnings passed down through families who'd lived near the mountain. A trail where hikers went missing. A place the maps didn't show. Rangers dismissed it as folklore, but that didn't stop the whispers. Emma had vanished near the northern section, and for those who'd grown up hearing the stories, it wasn't just coincidence. Then came the environmental theories. Wildlife experts suggested the possibility of a cougar attack. Mountain lions were native to the area, a silent ambush, quick and clean. The theory gained traction for a few days, enough to justify a brief closure of nearby trails. But there was a problem. A big one. Cougars don't bury every trace. They drag, they feed, they leave behind bones, fur, and signs of struggle. Not once in over 40 days of searching was there a single shred of physical evidence to support that theory. No blood, no torn clothing, nothing. Some turned to the weather. Meteorological data from June 4th showed a sudden drop in visibility in the region between 2:30 and 3:15 p.m. A dense fog rolling down from the western ridge. For a hiker on unfamiliar terrain, it could be disorienting. That aligned with the last time Emma was seen and the location of her last phone ping. But even if she had gotten lost, why was there no sign of her anywhere within the radius she could have physically covered? Every search radius was based on Emma's presumed mobility, time elapsed, and known trail difficulty. Yet, every model fell apart. She wasn't where she should have been. No discarded items, no campsite, not even a footprint. By week 3, the tone began to shift. Volunteers kept showing up, but the energy changed. Frustration replaced adrenaline. People whispered more quietly. Some began to question what they weren't being told. Was there something in her past no one knew? Could she have left on her own? Emma's parents stayed near the site in a motel. Her mother made sandwiches for searchers. Her father walked the trail alone at night with a flashlight, calling her name in a voice that grew smaller with each passing day. They refused to leave. They clung to hope, even as the ground offered nothing back. Investigators followed up on every sighting, every anonymous tip. A woman spotted at a gas station in Idaho, a camper who claimed to hear crying near the ridge at night, a set of bones found 2 counties over, ultimately ruled as animal remains. Each time the family braced for news, each time it was nothing. By day 43, the official search was suspended, not closed, but scaled back to what authorities called ongoing status. It was a polite way of saying the trail had gone cold, resources were reallocated, the media moved on, and Coldwater Ridge was reopened to the public with no ceremony, no conclusion, just a quiet notice posted online. Emma's parents didn't leave for another week. What lingered most wasn't just the silence, it was the symmetry. One moment, a young teacher walked into the woods, and the next, she was gone. Not lost, not taken, just gone. And yet, deep down, no one involved truly believed she had vanished without a trace. Not entirely. Because places don't erase people. Someone, or something, always knows more than they're saying. And in this case, the mountain wasn't talking. With no signs of Emma in the woods and every search effort exhausted, the investigation took a quieter, more complicated turn. The focus shifted away from the forest and toward Emma herself, her relationships, her routines, and the kind of life she was living in the months leading up to the school picnic. Investigators began asking a different question. What would make a young woman walk away from everything she had? The surface-level image was familiar. Devoted teacher, stable job, close to her parents, no history of mental health issues, no criminal background. But underneath, there were fractures. Emma had recently ended a 6-month affair with a married faculty member. His name was kept out of the press at the time, but internally, the school district was aware of the relationship. It had been discreet, quiet, but not invisible. According to one colleague, Emma had confided that she ended it because it made her feel used and exposed. The man, whose identity remains sealed in public records, confirmed the breakup and cooperated with police. He said they hadn't spoken in weeks and provided text logs to support his claim. His wife never gave a statement. Then came the discovery of several deleted texts recovered from Emma's phone records. One stood out, sent just 3 days before the picnic, to a number registered through a VoIP service. No name, no contact history. The message simply read, "Is it safe?" Investigators were never able to determine who she was messaging or what the context was. The account had been deactivated 2 days after she disappeared. There was no reply found on her end. 5 days after the disappearance, a man in Yakima, Washington, 3 hours north of Coldwater Ridge, called in a tip. He claimed to have picked up a young woman hitchhiking along Highway 12. She fit Emma's description, late 20s, blonde, wearing dusty clothes, no bag. According to him, she didn't say much and seemed nervous. When he asked if she was okay, she reportedly said she just needed to get to town. He dropped her off outside a gas station and never saw her again. Surveillance footage was pulled, but by the time it was reviewed, the tapes had already been overwritten. The man passed a polygraph, but the sighting was never confirmed. Her parents didn't believe it was her. The police weren't sure what to believe. As the weeks dragged on, internet forums and amateur sleuths latched onto the story. Some pushed the theory that Emma had staged her disappearance. They pointed to her VoIP messages, her recent breakup, and what they called behavioral shifts mentioned in interviews. One Reddit thread dissected photos of her from the picnic, claiming her posture showed detachment or withdrawal. Others accused the school district of covering up an internal scandal. The noise online became so loud that the local sheriff's department had to issue a statement denying rumors of a hidden suspect or employee misconduct. Then, during a search of Emma's apartment for missing journal entries, detectives found a second diary tucked inside a stack of old lesson plans. It wasn't hidden, just overlooked. The entries dated back several months and painted a different portrait than the one shown in the media. Emma had been struggling, not visibly, not loudly, but internally. She wrote about feeling isolated at work, unsure who she could trust. There were veiled references to whispers in the hallway, to a growing sense that someone was watching her too closely. She never named names. Some pages were scratched out entirely. Others were left unfinished. One entry from April read, "It's like they know I know. I'm not sure what to do with that." Another from mid-May, "I wish I could just hit reset. I'm tired of waiting for something to break." Her mother dismissed the writing as stress from work. Emma was the kind of person who internalized too much. But to investigators, it hinted at something deeper. Something, or someone, she didn't feel safe naming. The married co-worker was quietly brought back in for a second round of questioning. This time, the tone was different, more specific. Investigators wanted to know if Emma had discovered anything about him, anything that might have made her a target. Again, he denied any wrongdoing. Again, no charges were filed. His alibi remained intact. There was no evidence connecting him to Emma's disappearance, no forensic link, just tension and speculation. As the weeks turned into months, the case began to lose momentum. Media coverage slowed. The tips stopped coming. The search was over, and with nobody, no suspect, and no new leads, the investigation quietly moved to the back of the file queue. Emma's parents continued to hold out hope, continued to appear at every town meeting, and continued to ask the same question that no one could answer. Where is she? Privately, some officers believed she had walked away on purpose, that something in her life had pushed her to the edge, and she had chosen escape over confrontation. Others believed the opposite, that someone close to her had a reason to want her gone and had planned it carefully. But in either theory, there was always one missing piece. If she had planned to run, why leave behind everything that could help her survive? Her ID, her wallet, her car, her keys. And if someone had taken her, how had they done it without leaving a single trace? Whatever happened that day, the answer had left with Emma, and for a long time, it stayed buried. By the start of 2017, Emma Leland had become a name mentioned in past tense. Her face still appeared on missing persons flyers, but the calls stopped, the updates stopped, the reporters stopped coming. Her disappearance had shifted from an active case to an open question no one knew how to answer. Coldwater Ridge reopened. Hikers returned, and life in Echo Valley moved on, except for the people who couldn't. Her parents never stopped. Every year on June 4th, they held a candlelight vigil outside the school. Sometimes a few dozen people came, sometimes only 5. The school stopped sending official representatives after 2019. Emma's mother stood outside grocery stores, handing out flyers until her hands blistered from the cold. Her father took a second mortgage to pay for billboards. One went up along Route 26 with the words, "Where is Emma Leland?" in bold white letters across her high school graduation photo. It stayed up until weather peeled the edges and the funding dried out. Detectives checked in every few months, mostly out of courtesy. By all accounts, the file hadn't been touched in over a year. The evidence room still held her locked purse, her classroom planner, and a sealed envelope of printed trail maps from the day of the picnic. All cataloged, all untouched. Then, in early 2021, something strange happened. A true crime podcast called Red Pines ran a 2-part episode on Emma's case. The host, a former forensic analyst named Dan Hartford, suggested a possible link between Emma's disappearance and an unsolved cluster of cases involving lone female hikers who had vanished across the Pacific Northwest between 2009 and 2016. The victims varied in age and background, but one detail stood out. Each was last seen alone, near isolated state park trails, in areas with known blind spots for cell reception. Hartford proposed that the disappearances might be connected to a pattern, a roaming offender who knew the terrain better than most. and who avoided detection by targeting transient zones between counties. He speculated that Emma had not walked off that day. She had been watched, selected, and taken. The podcast went viral for a brief window, shared across forums, discussed on Reddit, even picked up by a regional news outlet. Emma's mother listened to the episodes twice a day for nearly a month. She wrote letters to the show, pleading for more investigation, but Hartford eventually moved on to other cases. Police reviewed the claim, but found no physical evidence linking Emma's case to the others, no matching DNA, no overlapping suspects. The theory faded like everything else. In 2022, a temporary ripple of hope resurfaced when a forest ranger doing maintenance on a firebreak trail discovered a decaying sandal, women's size 7. In a patch of overgrown brush, roughly 12 miles northwest of the trail Emma had last been seen on. It was sun-faded, partially buried, and didn't match any recent missing persons cases. For days, local law enforcement treated it as a potential break. Emma's mother was contacted. A forensic team tested the sandal for biological material. The results came back inconclusive. The style was compared to Emma's known footwear from the day of the picnic. It didn't match. It was later traced to a brand discontinued in 2010. Authorities concluded it had likely been there for years, discarded or lost. Another dead lead. By late 2023, the emotional cost had started to leave its mark. Emma's father, who'd been the louder of the two, who'd organized marches and stood outside city council meetings with a sign around his neck, had begun to withdraw. His health declined rapidly that fall. Diagnosed with late-stage pancreatic cancer in September, he passed away 6 weeks later. He never saw resolution. At his bedside, according to his sister, his last words were, "Someone at that school knows." Emma's mother became more private after that. She stopped answering media calls, declined interview requests, and took down the last billboard. She still visited Coldwater Ridge once a year. She'd park in the same spot where Emma's car had been found, sit on the hood, and wait until the sun went down. She told one friend that it made her feel closer to her daughter, like maybe Emma had sat there too just before it happened. By the end of 2024, there were no more vigils, no new flyers, no active investigators assigned to the case. On paper, Emma Leland was still missing, still technically part of Oregon's Unsolved case database. But off paper, in the real world, she had become what so many missing people eventually become, a memory that faded the moment attention shifted. But there were things still unspoken. One former colleague, who had since retired, once told a local journalist off the record that the school administration had downplayed internal tensions in the weeks before Emma vanished, that not all of the teachers had been forthcoming. Emma had complained about feeling unsafe after hours, though no formal reports were ever filed. The journalist tried to pursue the lead, but no one else would talk. And while most of the world had stopped asking questions, something still lingered in the background of the investigation. A gap. A silence that didn't quite add up. A missing person case with no evidence, no body, no eyewitness, and no logical entry or exit. What had begun as a local mystery was now part of a broader pattern that no one could explain. And even though the case had gone cold, the feeling never fully left, because the forest hadn't given her back, and it wouldn't, until someone went far enough to find what it was hiding. In October 2025, nearly a decade after Emma Leland vanished, Coldwater Ridge was quiet again. The air was thinning with the season. Leaves were starting to burn orange along the treetops. The main trails had closed for winter prep, but no one patrolled the off-limits western basin, a stretch of rugged forest beyond the mapped paths, cordoned off years ago after a series of rock slides made it unsafe for hikers. Most people stayed away. But not Travis Monroe. Travis was a local, lived 30 minutes out in a cabin with no neighbors and no interest in city rules. He'd hunted that forest since he was a teenager. He knew the ridge better than most of the rangers who now worked it. That morning, he was tracking a mule deer through a narrow animal corridor near the basin's edge when something off caught his eye. Just beyond a collapsed cedar, partially buried in a nest of leaves and rotting bramble, was a shape that didn't belong. Pale, angular, still. At first he thought it was driftwood. Then he saw the curve of his jaw, He didn't touch it. He backed away slowly, hiked out of the woods, and called it in from a gas station. Authorities were on site within hours. Crime scene tape went up. A mobile forensics unit was deployed. For the first time since 2016, Coldwater Ridge was locked down for investigation, not search. The remains were badly weathered. The forest had taken its time. What was left of the skeleton had been partially covered by soil erosion and heavy brush. Nearby, investigators flagged several personal items: a torn, decayed backpack with frayed shoulder straps, a rusted-out flip phone with no battery, and what appeared to be a yellow nylon strap knotted in a half-loop. It looked like a lanyard, the kind teachers often wore to carry their school IDs. They bagged everything: cataloged, photographed, preserved. It would take 4 days for the state lab to confirm what some already suspected. The partial remains belonged to Emma Leland. The news broke quietly at first. Just a line in a sheriff's office press release, but within 24 hours it made its way to local stations, then regional networks. Remains discovered at Coldwater Ridge identified as missing teacher Emma Leland, gone since 2016. It was the headline her mother had long feared and long prayed for, depending on the day. Investigators returned to the site and expanded the grid. Cadaver dogs were flown in again, older now but trained for bone scent. Forensic teams recovered additional fragments: 2 molars, a section of clavicle, a boot sole. Less than 60% of the full skeleton was accounted for. No clothing intact, no clear signs of trauma from the bones alone. But the items found with her told their own story. The flip phone, once cleaned and examined, was a match for the device Emma had been carrying the day she disappeared. Model number, SIM card serial, all confirmed. The battery had long since corroded, and the internal memory was unreadable, at least initially. The backpack, according to her mother, matched the canvas one Emma had bought the month before the picnic, navy blue with a broken zipper. The lanyard, once tested, revealed faded ink along the strap: Echo Valley Middle School. An ID badge had likely been attached, now lost to time. News crews came and went. Old podcast hosts resurrected their episodes. Online forums reopened dormant threads. For the first time in 9 years, there were answers. Not all of them, not yet. But something real. The location of the discovery raised immediate questions. The Western Basin was miles from Emma's last known position, past 3 ridge points, across unmarked terrain, and outside the original search radius. It was also geographically sealed off from the public. No trail reached it. The only way to access it was through animal corridors or from the northern fire access roads, routes only hunters, poachers, or ex-park staff would know. Travis Monroe was questioned thoroughly. He had no criminal history, no connection to Emma, and no known ties to the school or surrounding community. His story held. Phone GPS backed it up. He was cleared within days. The working theory emerged slowly. Emma had not simply wandered off. She had either been taken or led to that part of the forest. It was too far, too specific, too remote for a casual wrong turn. The items found with her also told investigators something else. Whatever happened to her, it hadn't been instant. The presence of her bag, her phone, her ID, still grouped together, suggested she had been stationary for a period of time, possibly days. Emma's mother was brought in to formally identify the items. She did so quietly, without press. She accepted the coroner's findings. She didn't ask to see the bones. She just held the yellow lanyard in her lap for a long time and whispered that she always knew her daughter hadn't left on her own. With the remains confirmed, authorities launched a full forensic investigation into the area. Soil samples were taken. A ground-penetrating radar team was deployed to map subsurface anomalies near the site. Within 72 hours, they found something else. Less than 100 yards away from the skeleton, buried beneath a shallow mound of pine needles and debris, was the partial foundation of a man-made structure: rotted wood, rusted nails, and a collapsed metal frame. It was too old to be recent, but not old enough to be forgotten, and someone had gone to great lengths to keep it hidden. The bones were confirmed through dental records first, then mitochondrial DNA. There was no longer any doubt. The partial skeleton found tangled in the underbrush belonged to Emma Leland. It was a conclusion that came with weight, finality without clarity. But it was what came after that changed the course of the investigation. In the forensics lab, analysts examined the skeletal remains for trauma. Most of the bones had been weathered, fractured naturally from time and the environment, but the right forearm, specifically the radius, showed something different, a clean spiral fracture just above the wrist, the kind typically caused by blunt force. The angle of the break suggested a defensive injury. It was consistent with someone raising their arm quickly to block a blow. The forensic team couldn't say for certain whether the injury came from an assault or a fall, but it happened before death, not after. There was something else. Tissue samples were recovered from underneath what remained of Emma's fingernails, thin keratin scrapings preserved by soil conditions. Analysts ran the DNA and found a partial male profile. It didn't match anyone in the National Offender Database. Not her boyfriend, not her co-workers, not the hunter who discovered her remains. It was an unknown male, identity still pending. But the most significant discovery came from a place no one expected to yield anything: the flip phone. At first, it was assumed the corroded device would be unreadable. The battery had ruptured. The internal circuits had been waterlogged for years, but digital forensic experts disassembled it, treated the memory board, and were able to extract fragments of data. Most of the files were corrupted. The call logs were gone, the text messages were empty. But one file remained. An image, a single photo, time-stamped June 4, 2016, 2:17 p.m. The photo wasn't clear. It was degraded, pixelated, but recoverable. Emma's face was in the frame. Close, as if she'd taken it herself. Her eyes were wide, the corners of her mouth tense, not in a smile, not in a pose. Behind her was a tree, bark ridged and split, and to the right, blurred but visible, the shadow of a figure, male, tall, shoulders hunched forward, the arm is partially visible, hanging low. It didn't look like a posed selfie. It looked like a moment captured mid-panic, maybe accidental, maybe desperate. Investigators studied the image for hours. They ran enhancement software. They couldn't make out the man's face, but the timestamp placed it within minutes of when Emma left the school group and vanished. It may have been the last thing she ever did. When Emma's mother was shown the image, she asked only one question: did she send it to anyone? The answer was no. The photo had been stored locally. It was never sent, never backed up, never uploaded. Whoever she saw that day, she didn't have time to share it. The discovery added a layer of confirmation to a theory that had quietly circulated for years but was never fully pursued. Emma hadn't gotten lost. She hadn't run away. Someone had been out there. Someone had seen her. The team reopened all previous suspect lists. They began running the unknown DNA profile against genealogy databases. They pulled park staffing logs, maintenance contractor records, fire service rosters, anyone who had access to the area. They reviewed background checks of former rangers, surveyors, trail contractors, even wilderness therapy staff who'd operated in the region prior to 2016. They started asking about one specific question: who knew that area better than anyone else? In the meantime, they scoured the area around the bones again, every root, every stone, every square foot of the forest floor. They found nothing new, but they didn't need to, because the image on that phone had changed everything. It had proven one thing investigators had never been able to say definitively: Emma had seen someone before she died. She'd feared him enough to try capturing his presence on camera, and somewhere in that blur was the answer to a question people had asked for 9 years. The press didn't have access to the photo. It wasn't released publicly, but the story leaked. Terrified selfie recovered on dead woman's phone. And the case erupted again. News anchors speculated, comment sections filled with guesses, online sleuths tried to recreate the angle, match the trees, and dissect the shadow. But no one could decode the man behind her. He remained just out of reach, like everything else in her story. Still, investigators weren't starting from zero anymore. They had remains. They had DNA. They had a time-stamped image. And now they had a timeline. Because the moment Emma pressed that shutter, she didn't just leave behind a clue. She created a clock. Something happened to her within minutes of that photo, and whoever was standing behind her, He didn't expect her to take it. When investigators widened the search grid around the location of Emma's remains, they weren't expecting to find much. The terrain was dense, the ground uneven, and nearly a decade of weather had swallowed anything man-made. But on the second day of extended surveying, about 70 yards northwest of where her phone had been discovered, a forensics officer spotted something strange beneath a collapsed canopy of branches and moss. At first glance, it looked like debris, maybe old fencing or a disused trail marker. But as they cleared the growth away, the outline of a structure began to emerge. It was a shack, single room, hand-built, rough lumber nailed together with rusted brackets, most of it long since rotted through. No address, no number, no official park record in public files. But buried deep in the state forestry archives, an internal maintenance report from 2002 made brief mention of a fire watch shed, constructed years earlier as a temporary ranger outpost. The structure was believed to have been dismantled during a controlled burn in 2005. But it wasn't. The interior was dark, choked with mildew and decay. The roof had caved in, and years of snowmelt had flooded the floor. Still, certain details had endured. Along one wall, a mold-stained mattress lay crumpled on splintered plywood. In the corner, fragments of duct tape adhered to the inside of an old wooden beam. Near the base of the doorway, a rusted hunting knife sat half buried in dirt. Scattered beneath the mattress were scraps of fabric, torn, knotted. Clothing remnants, possibly. Everything was bagged, logged, and sent to the lab. When the results came back, the case shifted from tragic mystery to criminal investigation. On two separate objects, the duct tape and the knife handle, analysts found DNA that matched the unknown male profile recovered from beneath Emma's fingernails. Whoever had been in that shack had not only been there recently enough to leave a biological trace, but they had direct physical contact with Emma. It confirmed what investigators had feared. She had been brought there. With a viable DNA profile now linked to the shack, investigators began the next phase, trying to match the genetic data to a real person. They ran it through CODIS again. Still no match. Then they turned to public genealogy databases. Slowly, partial matches began to emerge. Distant relatives, fourth or fifth cousins. It took weeks of reverse engineering through family trees, but eventually a name surfaced. Clyde Mercer, born in 1965, former employee of the Oregon Department of Forestry. Mercer had worked as a groundskeeper and backwoods maintenance contractor throughout the late 90s and early 2000s. For a time, he was responsible for upkeep on unpaved access roads, firebreak trails, and utility shacks, including Coldwater Ridge. Employment records showed that he was terminated from his position in 2014. The official reason listed was failure to adhere to conduct policies, but internal HR memos, buried in a file marked confidential, revealed more. In 2013, a seasonal wildlife biologist filed a report stating Mercer had followed her on multiple occasions while she worked on independent surveys near the Western Ridge Basin. She described him as overly familiar, persistent, and eventually aggressive. She said he made comments that felt threatening, things about how remote the woods were, how no one would hear if something happened. No charges were ever filed. Mercer denied the accusations, but his contract was not renewed. After his termination, Mercer faded from public record. He moved several times, lived in trailers, outbuildings, and eventually a cabin 25 miles south of Coldwater Ridge. Neighbors later described him as reclusive, never had visitors, didn't talk much. In 2019, he died in a single-vehicle crash, intoxicated, on a logging road just outside Grants Pass. No autopsy was requested beyond toxicology. He was buried by the county. No known family came forward. Until now, his name had never appeared in connection with Emma's case. He wasn't part of the original suspect list. He had no known criminal record, no violent priors. But now, his DNA placed him at the exact site where Emma's remains were found. It connected him to items that suggested confinement, restraint, and a space designed to be hidden. Investigators theorized that after being fired in 2014, Mercer returned to the ridge using access routes he knew by heart. The basin, closed to the public and largely forgotten by the department, gave him the isolation he needed. The shack, thought to be destroyed, became his. A place no one looked, a place he may have used before. Whether Emma was a random victim or someone he'd observed in the days before the school picnic remains unclear. The park was open that day. Dozens of people were on site, but Emma had wandered away alone, likely for a phone call, and within minutes vanished without a trace. Authorities now believe Mercer either lured her or intercepted her along a blind turn in the trail, using knowledge of the terrain to disappear into an area no one searched. The photo on her phone, the DNA under her nails, the injury to her arm. It all pointed to a struggle. Investigators believe she fought. At some point, possibly after being held at the shack, she managed to grab her phone and take a picture, maybe as a warning, maybe as evidence. And then, something went wrong. Whether she died during an escape attempt or from exposure or by force couldn't be determined definitively. But Mercer's presence there could no longer be explained away. He was the one the forest had been hiding, and he had kept Emma in the dark long after the world stopped looking. Once the DNA match was confirmed, the name Clyde Mercer was no longer just an obscure file in the state forestry archives. He became the central figure in what was now being called the Emma Leland case. For nearly a decade, Mercer's name had never appeared in any interview, suspect list, or background check. He had no direct connection to Emma, no overlap with the school, and no witnesses had ever mentioned him. But now, he was the only name that mattered. Mercer had lived in a small, weather-worn cabin just over 20 miles south of Coldwater Ridge. His property sat behind a gravel service road that wasn't listed on most GPS maps, half hidden behind overgrowth and old fencing. After his death in 2019, the cabin was emptied by the county, and a local storage company took possession of the contents, a set of old furniture, personal documents, and several water-damaged boxes that no one had opened since. Investigators requested access to the unit. What they found inside painted a disturbing picture of a man who had spent years on the fringe, observing, recording, and possibly planning. Among the items were 3 composition notebooks wrapped in a garbage bag and sealed with electrical tape. Inside were dozens of handwritten entries, most of them fragmented, erratic, and filled with strange references. Mercer wrote about the woods constantly, about patterns in the trees, about hikers who deserved to be watched, and about a place he called the Circle. One entry stood out immediately, dated June 6, 2016, 2 days after Emma's disappearance. The handwriting was sloppier than the rest. It read, "She made noise. I almost got out. But the angel fell quiet again. Quiet is better. Quiet doesn't leave." There were earlier entries too, in April of that year. The trail's open again. More kids, easier to find when alone, blonde hair shines brighter in the fog. And in May. She looked at me. Did she know, or just sense? I'll find the moment. He never named Emma, but the descriptions were clear. Investigators cross-referenced attendance records and park visitor logs. Emma was the only Echo Valley teacher with blonde hair at that year's school picnic. Further digging into Mercer's background revealed what hadn't come up in previous checks, because it had been sealed. In 2007, he was charged with misdemeanor assault in another Oregon county. The victim was a 22-year-old hiker who claimed Mercer approached her on a remote trail, asked invasive questions, and followed her back toward the parking lot. When she tried to ignore him, she alleged he grabbed her arm. She was able to fight him off and escape. The case was pled down, and the records were sealed under a first-time offender agreement. He paid a fine. No jail time. Then there were the other reports. 3 separate complaints filed between 2010 and 2014 by female park staff and hikers. All described similar behavior, being watched, followed, or approached by a man matching Mercer's description. None led to charges. One woman wrote that Mercer seemed to know the woods better than anyone and warned her no one would find her if she went too far off trail. At the time, no one connected those reports to any larger concern. They were treated as isolated incidents, creepy but not criminal. And now, years later, Mercer was no longer alive to answer for any of it. He died in 2019 when his truck veered off a logging road near the base of Rogue Valley. Blood alcohol was nearly 3 times the legal limit. There was no note. No one came to the hospital. He was buried in a county plot with a numbered marker and no headstone. By the time his DNA was matched to the items in the shack, he'd already been dead for 6 years. But in those years before his death, it now appeared Mercer had built himself a hidden world, one tucked inside a forgotten structure in the most unreachable part of Coldwater Ridge, the place where Emma's remains were eventually found, a place only he knew how to reach. Based on the timeline reconstructed by investigators, Emma was likely abducted less than 15 minutes after stepping off the trail. The terrain, the timing, the evidence, it all pointed to planning. Mercer didn't stumble upon her. He waited. He watched the group arrive, waited for one to separate, and when she did, he moved, quickly, quietly. Authorities now believe Emma was held inside that shack for hours, possibly days. The duct tape, the mattress, the remnants of food packaging found in the surrounding area all suggest prolonged captivity. The fracture in her arm, the torn fabric, the signs of resistance all point to a violent escape attempt. They believe she managed to flee the shack, possibly injured, and made it as far as the spot where her remains were later discovered. Less than 100 yards, close enough to see light through the trees. But she didn't make it out. No cause of death could be determined due to the condition of her remains. Exposure was possible. So was trauma. Either way, no one came for her in time. And Mercer disappeared back into his silence. Though he never stood trial, never confessed, and left behind no fingerprints in any official investigation, what he did leave was something more damning. A trail of obsession that ended in a real person's disappearance, a teacher, a daughter, a life taken and buried under almost a decade of quiet. And as investigators packed up the last of the evidence from his storage unit, one journal remained open on the table. Its final entry was dated just weeks before Mercer's death. It read only, "She never stopped looking at me, not even when I closed the door." And finally, authorities understood. Emma hadn't just vanished. She had been trapped, hunted, and hidden. But not anymore. Emma Leland's mother stood on the edge of the basin, staring at the earth where the shack once stood. There was no structure left, just disturbed ground, fresh soil, and silence. In the distance, a plaque had been installed at the trailhead, far from here. This place would never be open to the public again. What happened here wasn't for display. It was for remembering and for letting go. They held the burial quietly. Just family. There wasn't much to bury. A handful of bones, a lanyard, and the phone that held the last thing Emma ever did, a blurred photo taken in fear, trying to capture a man she didn't know in a place she never should have been. But that one act, that one decision to turn the camera on, gave investigators the one lead that couldn't be ignored. It was a moment of clarity inside something unimaginable. Forensic experts believe Emma was taken quickly, likely ambushed before she had time to react. Mercer knew the terrain. He knew the blind corners, the offshoot trails, the parts of Coldwater Ridge where cell reception died. They think he led her, or forced her, toward the basin where the shack stood, a structure even the park had forgotten existed. Inside, they found enough to piece together what happened: duct tape, torn fabric, a mattress, and his DNA on every surface. She was held there, not for hours but for days. She tried to escape. She fought. The fracture in her arm, the DNA under her fingernails, the knife tucked under the floorboards, it all pointed to a struggle. And then, somehow, she got out. They found her bones less than 50 yards from the cabin. That's close. Close enough to see the trees thin, close enough maybe to hear movement on the trail. But her injuries, the cold or something else, stopped her there, and the forest kept her secret. For 9 years, that part of the mountain said nothing. No clues, no witnesses, no signs. Just silence while people guessed, speculated, and slowly gave up. But now it had spoken, in bones, in photos, in evidence that couldn't be denied. And even though Mercer died without answering for it, the truth caught up to him. His name would be remembered now, not as a ghost, but as the man who stalked a teacher and left her hidden in the woods. Emma was returned to her family, and her story, once a haunting question, was finally given an ending. Because what remained in the woods wasn't just what was lost, it was everything she left behind to be found.